Okay, let's unpack this system, this whole world of biochemical messengers that basically keeps us alive and adaptive intercellular communication.
It really is the foundation for you to respond to stress, to grow, to just maintain your blood sugar.
Yeah.
Your body needs this uh, incredibly sophisticated messaging network.
And what's so fascinating is how our view of it has changed. We used to have this neat picture of, the nervous system as fixed telephone lines and the endocrine system as like mobile radio
But
waves.
that's all blurred now. They fundamentally converged. So many neurotransmitters look almost identical to hormones. And, well, a lot of hormones are actually made right there in the nervous system.
Which means the old definition of a hormone had to expand too. It started with that really restrictive classical idea, right?
Right. Synthesized in organ A, travels through the blood, acts on organ B, very linear.
But that misses so much of the action.
It misses the most crucial parts. We now have to include paracrine action, where a message just hits the cells next door, and even autocrine action, where the message acts back on the very cell that sent it out. No blood travel needed.
So our mission for this deep dive is to get into the nuts and bolts of how the body manages this, the sheer biochemical diversity of over 50 known hormones, their synthesis, transport, action, everything that keeps us in that tight balance we call homeostasis.
And that entire journey, that whole concept, it really starts with the idea of specificity.
Exactly. And you have to appreciate the scale of the challenge here. Hormones are circulating at these incredibly low concentrations. We're talking femtotin nanomolar. That's what, 10 orals to 10 moles per liter?
Just a tiny, tiny needle in a haystack. I mean, they're surrounded by molecules that look pretty similar. Other sterols, amino acids, peptides, but are present at concentrations millions, sometimes billions of times higher.
So how on earth does the body's machinery find the right signal and just ignore all of that background noise?
It does it through the target cell concept. And the key is that a target cell isn't defined by its location, but by its equipment. It's any cell where the hormone, the ligand, can bind to its cognate receptor,
The lock and key idea?
lock and key, but with very strict rules. For the binding to matter physiologically, it has to meet 3 criteria. 1, it's got to be specific, only the right keys fits, and you can prove it by blocking the lock with an antagonist.
Okay.
2, it has to be saturable. There's a finite number of locks, a limited number of receptors. And 3, and this is critical, the binding has to happen within that tiny concentration range where we actually see a biological response.
So it's the cell that really dictates the action, not just the presence of the hormone. The final response depends on, what, 2 big categories of things.
Pretty much. First, you have all the factors that affect the hormone's concentration, how fast it's made, how fast it's cleared, and if it's stuck to any transport proteins in the blood.
And sex.
Second are the factors at the target cell itself. The actual number of receptors on its surface, whether the cell is, ramping that number up or down, upregulation and downregulation, or even if the cell is just becoming less sensitive downstream.
Which leads us straight to the receptors. They are the absolute link between the message and the action.
They are. And every receptor is a protein with two essential jobs. It has a recognition domain that physically grabs the hormone, and a coupling domain that actually triggers the signal inside the cell.
And that dual function is where the magic happens, isn't it?
That's the first step of amplification. A tiny hormonal signal binding on the outside creates this massive cascade of events on the inside. It's incredibly efficient.
So let's start sorting these messengers. The easiest way seems to be based on where they bind. We've got 2 main groups.
Group I is the lipophilic hormones.
Your fat-soluble molecules. So steroids, thyroid hormones, TNT, calcitriol, retinoids, they can't stand water, so they immediately grab onto plasma transport protein.
Which is actually a huge advantage. A massive advantage. It protects them from being broken down and extends their half-life from minutes to, in some cases, days.
And being lipid-soluble, they can just, glide right through the cell membrane?
They do, just slip right through and bind to intracellular receptors, which might be hanging out in the cytosol or even waiting inside the nucleus. And what's so unique here is that the ligand receptor complex itself is the messenger. It goes straight to the DNA to turn genes on or off.
Okay, that's a stark contrast to group 2, the hydrophilic or water-soluble hormone.
Totally different strategy. These are your polypeptides, proteins, catecholamines. They're happy in the blood, so they circulate freely, but the trade-off is a really short half-life, often just a few minutes.
And they can't cross the membrane?
Can't get through. So they have to bind to cell surface receptors. The hormone is the first messenger, which then causes the cell to generate a second messenger on the inside.
And the body has a whole toolkit of these second messengers.
A huge toolkit. You have the famous cGMP system, used by hormones like ACTH and glucagon, usually working through G proteins. Then there's cGMP, which works with things like atrial natriuretic factor, or you get these really intricate pathways using calcium and phosphatidylinositols for angiotensin II.
And then there's the really complex stuff, the kinase and phosphatase cascades. This is where things like growth factors and, most famously, insulin play.
Insulin is the perfect case study. Its receptor is itself a tyrosine kinase. When insulin binds, the receptor basically switches on and starts phosphorylating itself and a ton of other proteins, kicking off this enormous rapid cascade of effects inside the cell.
So let's get into biosynthesis. How does the body create all this chemical diversity from really just a few starting materials?
It's remarkable. You have dedicated hormone factories like the pituitary, dual function organs like the ovaries, and then you have hormones like 1025-dihydroxydioes that require a whole team effort between the skin, the liver, and the kidney.
Let's start with the big one, the hormones derived from cholesterol, the steroids. Adrenal steroidogenesis is a fantastic model for this.
It is. Cholesterol is the precursor, of course.
But what's the actual regulatory bottleneck? What's the rate-limiting step?
It's getting that cholesterol into the mitochondrion. That's where the first reaction happens. And this transport step is controlled by a specific protein called the steroidogenic acute regulatory protein, or STAR. ACTH stimulates STAR, STAR moves the cholesterol, and the whole process kicks off.
And once it's inside, it's converted to pregnenolone.
And from that one common starting point, the adrenal cortex can go in three different directions. If you're making a mineralocorticoid like aldosterone, that's happening exclusively in the outer layer, the zona glomerulosa.
Why only there?
Because that layer, and only that layer, has the specific enzymes, the 18-hydroxylase and 18-hydroxydehydrogenase, that can do the final steps to make aldosterone. The localization of the tools defines the product.
And if you're making glucocorticoids like cortisol?
Then you're in the middle and inner zones. And that process is more complex. It involves this shuttling back and forth between the smooth ER and the mitochondria to get all the right hydroxyl groups put on in the right order.
And we can't forget the androgens, like DHEA. There's a really interesting enzyme there, right?
The P450C17. It's fascinating because it's a single enzyme that does two different jobs. It acts as both a 17-alpha hydroxylase and a 17,020 lyase, which is what allows the pathway to branch off and start making sex hormones.
Speaking of which, let's talk about the testes. How does the story change there?
Well, LH is the driver for that initial cholesterol conversion. But the most important story here is really about the prohormone concept with testosterone.
Meaning testosterone isn't always the final active form.
Exactly. In certain critical tissues, like the prostate, testosterone is actually converted into a much, much more potent androgen called dihydrotestosterone, or DHT.
Yeah.
That conversion is done by an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase. So again, the target cell gets the final say on the activity of the message.
And in the ovaries, for estrogen, it's a completely different mechanism again. It's all about aromatization.
Right, and the best way to understand that is the two-cell transfer hypothesis. It's a beautiful piece of biological logistics.
Lay it out for us.
Okay, so you have theca cells, and they produce the androgens like androstenedione and testosterone, but they can't make estrogen. They physically transfer those androgens to their neighbors, the granulosa cells. And the granulosa cells have the enzyme aromatase, which converts the androgens into estradiol.
That compartmentalization is brilliant.
It's perfect regulatory control, and clinically, that aromatase is so important. In postmenopausal women, aromatase activity in fat cells actually becomes the main source of estrogen. It's why aromatase inhibitors are such key therapeutic drugs.
Okay, let's wrap up the cholesterol story with calcitriol, or 1025-dihydroxy-D, the three-organ journey.
Right. It starts in the skin. UV light hits 7-dehydrocholesterol, and in a non-enzymatic reaction, it becomes vitamin D. From there, it goes to the liver for its first hydroxylation. Now, that step is totally unregulated.
Just happens automatically.
Just happens. It's only when that molecule gets to the kidney that the final, tightly regulated 1-alpha hydroxylation step occurs, producing the most potent form, 1025-dihydroxy-D-rose.
All right, let's switch gears. If cholesterol is the foundation for lipids, what's the common building block for the water-soluble messages? Let's move to the tyrosine derivatives.
Right, the catecholamines and thyroid hormones. The catecholamines, dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine are all built from the amino acid tyrosine. And the main control point is the very first enzyme, tyrosine hydroxylase. It's feedback inhibited by the end products.
And that's the logic behind using L-DOPA for Parkinson's, right?
Precisely. Dopamine can't cross the blood-brain barrier, but its precursor, L-DOPA, can. You bypass the regulated step.
The synthesis of epinephrine in the adrenal medulla has one of the most elegant regulatory loops.
It's a perfect illustration of neuroendocrine integration. Epinephrine is made by adding a methyl group to norepinephrine using an enzyme called PNMT. But the synthesis of PNMT itself is induced by the super high local concentration of glucocorticoids that are delivered directly from the adrenal cortex through this special portal system.
So the stress hormone cortisol drives production of the fight or flight hormone epinephrine.
Exactly. And those finished catecholamines are stored in granules, but it's only about an hour's supply.
Compare that with the thyroid hormones, T and T. They're also from tyrosine but can be stored for weeks.
It's a totally different manufacturing process. They are synthesized as part of a gigantic precursor molecule called thyroglobulin, or TGB. It's this huge protein that gets stored in the thyroid follicle. TSH, the stimulating hormone, then tells the cell to basically eat up bits of that thyroglobulin and hydrolyze it to release the T and T.
And T is really more of a prohormone too, isn't it?
It is. T is converted in the peripheral tissues by an enzyme called deiodinase into T, which is the much more potent active form.
Okay, our final class of hormones is built from even larger peptide chains, and here, the key regulatory step seems to be all about processing.
Insulin is the classic example. It starts as a pre-prohormone, then it's processed to proinsulin. And that single-chain proinsulin structure is essential for getting the disulfide bridges to form correctly. Only then is it cleaved into mature insulin and this other piece, the C-peptide.
And that C-peptide is really usable clinically.
Incredibly useful because it's released in a 1-to-1 ratio with insulin. So it's a perfect marker of how much insulin the body is actually making itself.
The regulation for parathyroid hormone, PTH, is just amazingly tight, happening right inside the gland.
It's almost unbelievable. When your plasma calcium levels are high, the gland will synthesize pro-PTH, but then it immediately degrade 80 to 90% of it before it's even secreted. It's this rapid intracellular braking system. Only when calcium drops does it let the finished PTH out the door.
And then there are hormones that are part of a bigger system, like angiotensin II.
Part of the whole renin-angiotensin system. It's a cascade. The liver makes angiotensinogen. The kidney, sensing low blood pressure, releases renin, which cleaves it to angiotensin I. Then angiotensin-converting enzyme, or ACE, cleaves that into the final superpotent vasoconstrictor, angiotensin II.
Which is why ACE inhibitors are so common for treating hypertension.
Exactly, you just break that final activation step.
For sheer diversity from one starting point, though, you can't beat the pro-opiomelanocortin, or POMC family.
No, it's the ultimate example of tissue-specific processing. It's a single 285 amino acid chain. In the anterior pituitary, it's chopped up to primarily yield ACTH. But in other tissues, that ACTH gets chopped up even further into things like MSH, melanocyte-stimulating hormone, and the endorphins. One gene, many, many different messages depending on the location.
So before we wrap this up, let's just touch on the transport proteins one last time. We've seen these wildly different storage times. No storage for steroids, hours for catecholamines, weeks for thyroid hormones.
And that's why those transport proteins for the group I lipophilic hormones are so vital. They solve the solubility problem, sure, but more importantly, they act as a circulating reservoir, and they dramatically extend the half-life. And you always have to remember, it's only the tiny free fraction that's biologically active.
And there are three major specialized ones to know.
The three big ones are TBG, thyroxine-binding globulin, which binds T so much more tightly than T that it gives T a half-life 4 to 5 times longer. Then you have CBG, corticosteroid-binding globulin for cortisol. And finally, SHBG, sex hormone-binding globulin, which binds testosterone with a higher affinity than estradiol, effectively controlling the concentration of active free testosterone.
Wow, okay. If you take anything away from this deep dive, it feels like there are three core ideas. First, the receptor is everything. It defines the target cell, it provides the specificity, and it starts the amplification.
Absolutely. Second, you have to marvel at the chemical versatility. Your body takes a handful of precursors, cholesterol, tyrosine, peptide chains, and generates this incredible diversity of messengers just by using different enzymatic tools in different places.
And finally, that regulation happens at every single step. It's not just about release. It's about transport into the mitochondria. It's about shuttling between organelles. It's about multi-organ activation. And it's about the transport proteins themselves. These complex steps are not just details. They are necessary requirements for us to adapt and survive.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over. How does the body coordinate the release and the effects of hormones with such drastically different lifespans in the blood minutes for epinephrine versus weeks for T, to maintain a perfectly smooth, stable homeostatic environment from one moment to the next.